What have we learned about each team after 2 weeks of this year's Six Nations? 2 weeks, I suppose, of the whole international season for the Northern Hemisphere teams as well. It's early days, but what have you noticed about your side? It could be absolutely anything, to the minute detail to the more general overview of where they currently are after 2 rounds. Welcome back to the channel. That's what I'm talking about in this video. It's always interesting doing these because I'll go through each team and speak about something or a couple of things that I've noticed. And as I say, it could be quite general, it could be in more detail, but it's always interesting hearing from you, particularly fans of other nations, because you'll just have a more in-depth focus than even I might have. Even though I watch all of the games, I cover all of the games, it's still always interesting to hear from you. So comment down below if you can subscribe to the channel as well, that'd be amazing, and like the video, all that sort of thing. But essentially, what have we learned about each side so far this Six Nations? I think it's an interesting way of looking at it. I'll run through each team and starting off with Ireland, who are one of the easier sides to talk about in all honesty, because they look incredibly strong. They've won both of their games. They are the heavy favourites to go on and not only win the Six Nations, but do back-to-back Grand Slams. Everything is looking pretty rosy from an Irish rugby or an Irish rugby fan's perspective. So I was trying to think about this. What have we really learned about this Irish team? I don't know if it's necessarily something new, but the thing that struck me was how strong the system is. In that we've spoken about this before, whether we want to talk about the pathways, whether we want to talk about the central contracts, or the way in which they're able to rotate and rest and control the workload on their players, or even if we want to talk about their attacking structure, their defensive structure. But it's just the system for Ireland is so strong. And I think that's maybe best exhibited by Jack Crowley coming in at 10, someone like Calvin Nash on the wing, and Joe McCarthy in the second row. You've had players in key positions, in particular key positions if we want to talk about fly half and second row, come in, slot in, not only look like they're able to come in and do a job, but absolutely thrive. I think this is an Irish team that the system around it, in terms of the detail in their game, as well as the wider things in the Irish system at the moment, is strong and it is working. And I think that has been reinforced in the opening couple of rounds of this Six Nations, particularly when you consider and compare them with France. Speaking of which, let's get on to the French, because they're one of the more difficult teams. If Ireland are easy, summing up what we've learned about France so far is a little bit more difficult. And I think when I look at this French team, because of the depth they have in their player pool, because of the quality they have in their squad, you can never write them off. That was exhibited in the Scotland game. They weren't great against Scotland. Scotland should have won that game. They wasted opportunities. They were robbed at the end, but France still found a way to win. And when you've got the quality of players that they have, when you have the balance in terms of some of the excitement in their attack, the astute tactical kicking game, plus the power in their forwards, they're always going to be a threat. But what have we learned? What have we had reinforced? Something seems to be missing. And I don't think it's purely down to the absence of Antoine Dupont. There's something wider, I think, in French rugby. I personally think it's been there for a little while. I wouldn't necessarily just draw this conclusion purely based upon the first 2 rounds of this Six Nations. I had questions over this French team heading into the World Cup. I thought they could win the World Cup, but I thought they'd had too many close games, and eventually one of those, they'd be on the wrong side of that result. Too many of those games at home, and that's ended up what ended up happening. So with France, they're still good. And I think the funny thing about this French side, I'm saying this, they've played Ireland and Scotland, who you would argue are probably the 2 best teams behind, or their 2 toughest tests in this championship. They've beaten Scotland. They could end up with 4 wins out of 5 at the end of this Six Nations, and everyone will look at it and say, well, all right, they lost to Ireland, but Ireland are exceptional, and actually France are still good. I'm not so sure about that. They are still good. And as I say, they've got great players, they've got brilliant depth. Something just doesn't seem to be right at this moment in time, in my opinion. Who knows? Maybe they'll lay down a statement in the same way they did against England at Twickenham last year, where they go and put 50 points on them, and all of a sudden any questions you have about them, you're forgetting about. But yeah, I'm just not sure about where France are at this moment in time. But speaking on to the team they most recently beat, Scotland. Now, putting aside the fact that there is a very strong argument that Scotland were robbed by the officials in that game against the French, that they should have won it, that decision should have gone their way, and all that stuff. Putting that aside, what have we learned? They're still not ruthless enough. They had so many opportunities in that game to add a score or add a couple of scores, and they weren't able to do it. And I think that has been the story for Scotland on too many occasions in matches like this one. Whether it was away to France the year before in the Stade de France, where they came away thinking they should have won the game, whether it was against Ireland, there's been a lot of occasions where this Scotland team, I think, has failed to really deliver in those moments, those tight moments where the game could go either way. I don't think they've been able to see it out. And I think that was another good example of that. Having said that, there's still a lot of strengths for Scotland. I'm nitpicking there. That's focusing on the negatives. They are still a very, very good team. But can they get over some of the big hurdles that they're faced with? And I think there continues to be questions of that nature about this side. So maybe in a similar way to Ireland, it's not something new that we've learned, but it is reinforcing some of the old questions that have been there, that they are still there for this side. On to England. What have we learnt about England over the opening 2 weeks of the Six Nations? They're 2 from 2. They played Italy and Wales, games that on paper they would have been expected to win, and they won them both by pretty slim margins. I think there is a sense now with this England team, the real test starts now in terms of the fixtures they have coming up. Away to Scotland, home to Ireland, away to France. What happens over these next 3 games will determine how we view this championship for England, I think. I think if they win one of them, then we'll be looking at it and thinking, okay, there's improvements, they are moving forward. In particular, if they put in performances, say, at home to Ireland or away to France, where they look like they're closing the gap on those 2 teams, I think there will continue to be a sense of positivity about England. And I think the optimism at the moment is understandable, despite the fact that neither of those scorelines against Wales or Italy have been convincing. I can understand why people are giving them a bit of leeway, because they're putting faith in the fact that they're trying to adapt, attack and defence. It's been spoken about loads. But it is faith at the moment rather than hard evidence. They haven't had that statement performance or win yet that I think people would have been looking for England. So the depth is good. I think that's been exhibited quite well this week with the England A team, and you look at some of the players in that team that you look at and say you could happily have them in the England starting team or in the matchday 23 at the moment. So they've got good depth, England, despite the fact of some of the players they're missing. I think that we've learned. We always know they have a big player pool, but there were areas of that squad, in particular the back row, that I think there were big question marks over. It's not perfect by any means, but I think that's something we've learned. And I think a lot of the questions we have will be answered over the next few weeks with what happens in some of those games. The big test for England starts now. They've given themselves a platform. They've done what they've needed to do, and credit to them, because they haven't always started Six Nations well over the last few years. They've got themselves a couple of wins. Are they now able to kick on? Where is this team actually? Because they might have won, but there hasn't necessarily been the style or substance to some of those victories that some people would have been hoping for or expecting. So that's, I think, the big thing for England. With Wales, what have we learned about Wales? Well, the thing for me is that their eligibility rules need to change, which is not something new. It is something that comes up all the time when you look at players moving to England or overseas and not having the amount of caps or all that stuff. I still think Welsh rugby isn't strong enough to try and keep players in Wales. I think you have to do what other nations have done and let people play wherever. And then, look, if it means some of your club sides are weaker, well, first of all, they're going to be weaker at the moment because they don't have the money compared to other teams. They're on a smaller budget. We're seeing that in the European or Champions Cup, Challenge Cup competitions where they're struggling to compete. So they're going to struggle to compete anyway. Give it as an opportunity for young players to come through. Give your experienced internationals an opportunity to go abroad and earn as much money as they possibly can. I think that's kind of what we're seeing with Wales at the moment. They don't have the depth. You saw that in the England game, some of the players coming off the bench, in particular when you compare it with England and that A team that I mentioned. I think it's that their eligibility rules need to change for Wales. I think that's what has been reinforced to me. Having said that, there's loads of positives for Wales. That's kind of a negative, but I agree with Warren Gatland, what he said after the England game, that he thinks in a couple of years' time, this has the potential to be a really good team. The way in which they have battled and competed against Scotland and against England, both games that they could have won, by the way. How different might this conversation have been if they did have 2 victories rather than 2 defeats? I think it's broadly positive for Wales, despite the situation they find themselves in. Let's finish off with the Italians then. What have you learnt about Italy? Gonzalo Quesada coming in off the back of a disappointing World Cup, a team with quite a lot of good players in it. They still need more time, I think, is what we're seeing. It's always so difficult with Italy, isn't it? Because we want them to win now. We want to see obvious steps of improvement now, rather than having to witness championship after championship where they're not winning any games. Didn't win any in the Six Nations last year, had a poor World Cup. I think there is reason for optimism for them though. And actually I think the big thing for Italy, which always strikes me in the Six Nations at least, is their accuracy in some key moments lets them down. I think that is the area that they have to answer. That's the question they have to answer. When the pressure is on, when they are in position to win games, do they have the discipline? Do they have the accuracy? Do they have the quality to be able to see it out? We saw it in the Six Nations last year on a few occasions. I still remember that game against Scotland at Murrayfield where they should have been able to get something out of it. They were close to almost drawing it. They pushed France really well in Italy and ended up losing that game with a fairly late try. And you look at the England game to start this championship, leading England at half-time, and their game in the second half, which of course to a degree was down to the good stuff England did in terms of putting pressure on them in defence. But you're leading and then you don't really fire a shot, drop balls, not able to build pressure. England were able to dictate the tempo of that second half. It's moments like that where I think this Italian team has over the last few years consistently struggled to deliver. That's a big one for them. Can they win this Six Nations? Maybe that Wales game on the final weekend is going to be the place that they're really able to do it. But we'll wait and see. But that's my general thoughts. What have we learned about each of these teams so far in this Six Nations? Only 2 games in, admittedly. And on some occasions, maybe it is more of a reinforcing of things we've seen previously rather than completely learning new things. But let me know, what do you make of it? I'm always intrigued to hear from fans from those individual nations because you might have more of an in-depth eye than I possibly have. So let me know in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next one.